My name is Fergus McCallum. So this is a Techdow sponsored symposium. Techdow is a pharmaceutical company who manufacture a low molecular weight heparin. So the title is Low Molecular Weight Heparins should be prescribed by the brand name. As I said, I'm Fergus, I'm a pharmacist. I'm the professional relationships manager for Techdow Pharma. Could I have the next slide, please, Joe? Go back one, please. Can I actually go back one? Sorry, thank you. It's obviously very, very important to be really clear about my status. So this is a sponsored promotional presentation on behalf of Techdow Pharma for Hexa and enoxaparin sodium. I'm delivering a presentation, and I am a UK registered pharmacist. I am employed by Techdow in a promotional role. So to be very, very clear, this is a promotional presentation, although it'll attempt to be as informative as possible about the topic. But I want to be very clear that I'm a promotional employee. Can I have the next slide, please? So Hexa enoxaparin sodium is a solution for injection presented in a syringe. Enoxaparin is roughly 30 years. It's been licensed in the UK. Obviously, it was licensed originally as the originator. So it was licensed as a brand name, a different brand name by a different company. Enoxaparin is a low molecular weight heparin, and it's an antithrombotic agent. It's obviously been around for, as I say, a very, very long time. Its license has evolved. The license for enoxaparin has evolved over the years. Currently, it's licensed for prophylaxis of medical patients and prophylaxis of surgical patients. It's used in the treatment of DVT and PE. It has an extended. It's used in extended treatment of deep vein thrombosis and PE to prevent the recurrence in patients with active cancer. It's also used to flush corporeal lines and extracorporeal lines, my apologies, in hemodialysis. And it's still used in ACS as well. As you can see, there's the full description of the license in front of you, which you can also use the QR code to get the full prescribed information. But in essence, it's used for both prophylaxis and treatment, and its license has become very extensive over that 30-year period. Could I have the next slide, please? As we've alluded to, but perhaps not quite said so far, enoxaparin, Hexa enoxaparin is a biosimilar. So obviously that leads to the question, which is the topic today, what is a biosimilar? Next slide, please. There are what I would call conventional pharmaceuticals and conventional generics. By conventional pharmaceuticals, I mean medicines that are chemically created in a controlled manufacturing environment. Their active ingredients are created in a chemical process, and they're generally very small and are relatively simple molecules. These sort of drugs go back as far as quinine, go back as far as aspirin. They are chemicals that are derived in a chemical process, can come from plants or can be purely derived in a chemical process. They are relatively small, simple molecules. There are brands. So if we take the aspirin example, which has been around for over 100 years, you've got Bayer, the manufacturer in Germany, who invented it, who had a brand name for it, Disprin. And then since then, there are hundreds of companies who make generic copies. The point being that the generic copies of the brand are identical, not similar, identical. If you removed the active ingredient from the originator's aspirin tablet, and you removed the active ingredient from a generic medicine's the active ingredient from the generic copy, and you could do whatever tests and whatever labs using whatever machines that you want, you won't be able to tell which one came from the originator and which one came from the generic company. They are the same. Generic companies are the same, if that makes any sense at all. Can we have the next slide, please? We then go into biopharmaceutical medicines, or as I like to call it, the originator. So the originator of enoxaparin, as an example, 30 odd years ago, did some research, did some experiments, found an interesting molecule, did phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, possibly phase 4 trials, developed a molecule, gave it a brand name, brought it to market. That molecule is complicated. It's a complex molecule. The reason for that is that biologics, biopharmaceuticals, come from a living thing. They either come from a single cell organism, which has been changed by modern techniques, these cells will live in a bioreactor and be fed and will generate either waste product or will themselves be processed into biologic medicines. For a very small number of biosimilars, an extremely small number, of which enoxaparin is one, these living organisms are actually larger than a single cell organism. So in the case of enoxaparin, the villi, the intestinal villi of a pig, is the source of the active drug. So either a very simple single cell molecule in a bioreactor, or in essence, the waste product from, in this case, to put no two finger word on it, from an abattoir. The important thing before we go on is there is inherent variability in batches of biologics. So before we go on to talk about biosimilars or copies, the originator product that your pharmacy bought this year is unlikely to be the same as the one they bought 2 years ago, or the one 4 years ago, or the one 28 years ago. There are tiny variations, and they are tiny. Living things behave differently, depending on the temperature, the nutrients, the altitude, the barometric pressure, UV light. Many, many things lead to tiny variations. Those variations are accounted for by the regulators, the MHRA, the MEA, the FDA, and within tight defined limits, those variations are acceptable. And those variations do not give any rise to any noticeable clinical difference when the medicine is used. Can we go into biosimilars now? Please, Joe. Thank you, Joe. Again, created in a living biological system. Again, large complex molecules. My apologies, my throat's gone. They are, again, inherently variable. In the same way as the originator, there will be batch-to-batch variations that are tiny within the limits allowed by the regulator. There will also be tiny variations, inherent variability from the originator. The originator may have their facility in one country at one altitude, in one temperature. The biosimilar may be in a different country, in a different part of the world, different height, different temperature. There may be slightly different changes in the source organism. The reality is they are very similar, but not the same. Can we have the next slide, please? So what is a biosimilar? If it's not a generic, if it's not a copy, what is it? If you look to the UK government, the MHRA, as recently as 2020, sorry, as recently as last year, my apologies, 2022, they again stated it's a similar biological medicinal product, a biosimilar. It's a new biological product that has been developed to be similar to an existing biological product called the reference product. I know we've left the EU, but the EMEA's position was and is a biosimilar is a biological medicine highly similar to another already approved biological medicine, the reference medicine. The takeaway point from the, and we could have put the FDA up, we could have put the Japanese regulator up, we could have put up many. They will all roughly come to the same thing, which is they are highly similar or very similar, but not the same. So if we can have the next slide again, please, Joe. So again, the only thing that happened in that slide change is to just re-emphasize that point. They are very, very similar. They are not identical. They are not generic drugs. They are not exact copies of each other in a chemical sense. Can I have the next slide, please? So why should biosimilars be prescribed by brand? There is a lot of resistance within both NHS trusts, secondary care, and primary care, GPs, medicines managers, to prescribing by brand. That is because the UK government, Department of Health, NHS England, the devolved countries, are all seeking to get best value for prescribing. We do not have limitless budgets. We need to cut our cloth to match our available money. Generics are exact copies, and as such, there is a culture in primary care of driving GPs and prescribing nurse prescribers to prescribe generically, because effectively you get the exact same drug, and when I use the word very, very chosen word, exact same drug for less money. So there is a culture in secondary care, and even more so in primary care, to not use brand names. And then even a better reason is because the regulator says so. Why should you prescribe biosimilars by brand name? You know why? Because the regulator says so. And we're a country, or countries in the UK, when the appropriate, correct regulator tells us to do something, we generally do it. So again, just to say what the regulator says, the MHRA says, and it's current and live and has been changed over the last 10 years, but still comes to the same position: all biological medicines, including biosimilars, should be prescribed by brand name. You couldn't be much clearer than that. The regulator is telling us to do so. The Department of Health is saying substitution at the pharmacy level without a consultant prescriber is not permitted for biological medicines, including biosimilars. So there is a really strong regulatory statement saying do not prescribe by INN or generic name. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so that's the nanny state telling us why we shouldn't do things. And to be honest, we are healthcare professionals, and when a regulator tells us not to do things, we normally listen. But most of us quite like to know why a thing's been said, rather than just accepting it. We are not used to just blindly following. We like to understand. So what's the problems at discharge from hospitals if you prescribe low molecular heparins by generic names? Trusts choose a particular brand through CMU. The CMU stands for the Commercial Medicines Units. So NHS hospitals, NHS trusts, NHS regions engage in procurement processes and try to get the best price they can. What that means for low molecular heparin, whether your trust has chosen our brand or someone else's brand of enoxaparin, or whether you choose a completely different molecule such as dalteparin or tinzaparin, the vast majority of hospitals only have a single brand present in the hospital. So if a prescriber chooses to write the generic name INN, enoxaparin, the reality is within that hospital, there is only one brand. It may be our brand. If it's a hospital that uses our brand, it may be another product. But the reality is the hospital only has a single brand. So if a prescriber writes a brand, if the prescriber writes by INN, the chances are they will get the brand that was intended by the hospital. If a prescriber writes a brand name internally in a hospital, and there are different processes and different trusts, but as a hospital pharmacist myself for 20 years, and having worked in perhaps a dozen different hospitals, generally speaking, either the ward staff or the ward pharmacist, clinical pharmacist, will amend a brand name to a generic name, to an INN, unless there was a really strong, valid clinical reason. And there are a few clinical reasons why you wouldn't. There are patients who have been transferred from another hospital already established on a brand. These are practical reasons why you wouldn't change, but the vast majority of reasons you would stay with the same brand. At discharge, there are electronic or paper discharge summaries, and where they state the name of the drug is enoxaparin by INN, you are, as a healthcare professional, as a nurse, as a prescriber, as a physician, you are creating a problem for the GP. You're creating a problem for the community pharmacist. Why are you doing that? Because they need to establish the intended brand. And we can explain why they need to establish the intended brand on the next slide, Joe. If we can change slides again, that would be useful. I appreciate that. So again, before we move on, discharge by brand. Sorry, I wasn't expecting that pop up. So again, Joe, thank you. We can't move away from the fact the regulator says so. That's something we must remember. But if we want to get beyond why and maybe understand why the regulator says so, they say so because they're not identical. But also, enoxaparin just doesn't come in a tablet, or you don't just pick up a little puddle of enoxaparin and somehow give it to the patient. It comes in a device. There are currently 4 different brands of enoxaparin, biosimilars. Again, not generics, not the same. Similar, but not the same. They actually come between them in 7 different devices. You might ask, so what? The reality is that most patients are not competent in self-injecting or subcutaneously injecting themselves. They're not diabetics. They're not patients on growth hormone. They haven't learned over a period of time how to daily inject subcutaneously. Nursing staff will spend a day or 2 days, and they will train, as part of the ward round, train the patients how to become competent to administer the drug. The patients generally are elderly, or certainly above the average age. They have different capabilities, they have different understanding levels, different ability to learn. Generally speaking, the nurses seek to discharge the patients in a way that they're able to carry on using the device they've learned when they're discharged. So the NHS has dedicated resource and time, and nurses have trained patients how to use the drug so that they can safely continue in primary care. Can I have the next slide, please? The injection technique is not the same. This is actually for one of our syringes, our brand. You will see the guard. There's a guard there to reduce needle stick injury. The originator has a device where you inject the drug, and the moment you pull away from the patient, the guard deploys. We've chosen a slightly different version that we don't deploy when you pull away. We wait until you press a second time and the guard comes down. We've chosen that to try and avoid bruising on the patient, but I'm in no way suggesting that the other brand is inferior. I'm simply saying the technique is different, and the technique is different for all 4 brands. And a brand that we have illustrated here in particular has an extremely different technique. If you look on the top right hand for me, there's an image of a device which has a small flappy paddle, which you then deploy afterwards. They are very different. And I'm sure as consultants, as physicians, as registrars, as nurses, we think we can work that out. You're not an 84-year-old patient who's never had to inject a subcut injection before, who's after 2 days tried to learn and has mastered a technique for one device. Can I ask for the next slide, please, if that's possible? Again, I can't emphasize enough the reason why you should not prescribe by INN generally is because the regulator said so. Biosimilars are not the same. The patient has been trained. However, there are other problems. The color codings, unfortunately, are different in all 4 brands, or perhaps even 5 brands now. That's a shame. I wish they weren't. And again, I can hear the gasps, the sounds. We're all healthcare professionals. We can all manage color code difference. Nobody should select medicine by color code. Yeah. Again, you're not an 84-year-old patient who's just gone home proud of mastering a technique and suddenly finds they're looking at a completely different device or a completely different color and wondering, shall we have a go or shall we just stop? Can I have the next slide, please? Of the 4 devices, the graduations and concentrations are not the same. So patients are trained to give a partial dose, so they can give a 90 milligram dose or an 84 milligram dose or 110 milligram dose, depending on the weight. They will be trained to count a number of graduations, but depending on how the graduations are, whether it's a 2 milligram gap between or a 2.5 milligram gap between, they may be told to take 12 graduations or 13 graduations and inject. That may not be the same on a different brand. And I'm not saying a different brand is better or worse. I'm saying it's not the same. The concentrations on some of the higher strengths are not the same. These are things that a nurse, an HCP, a healthcare professional can manage and do everyday manage and manage competently. Again, going back to my 84-year-old just been discharged. Once you start getting to the point where it's not the same number of graduations you're drawing up, it's in a different colored syringe, in a different device with a different technique, I'm beginning to wonder if they still feel that they've mastered the technique and will remain compliant and concordant. Can I have the next slide, please? Up until now, we've talked about why you should not prescribe generically, and we've talked about the patient, we've talked about the regulator, we've talked about the physician, the nurse, the pharmacist want to do the right thing. The NHS does need to save money. That's just a reality. And that's why GPs are encouraged to prescribe generically, and they're trying to do the best thing. biosimilars are not generics. The physician, the MHRA says they should prescribe by brand, but they may not be aware it's a biosimilar. They may miss the point. They're busy people. They may prescribe it by generic name. They may write enoxaparin. I don't want to bore you, but in primary care, the community pharmacist is paid according to tariff. This is a category C drug. Again, I could spend an hour talking about this, but we shan't. But in reality, no matter what brand the chemist gives, the NHS will pay the originator price. The GP has taken the patient off the brand the patient's been trained on, and they've used the generic name, and that will not result in a penny saving to the NHS. It's a lot of work, a lot of effort, and all that's happened is the NHS has saved not one penny, and the patient, the 84-year-old patient, is now wondering what on earth the syringe they've got in their hand is. They're confused by the different technique, the different colour, different graduations. It's good to save money, not with absolutely no upside for the patient whatsoever. Can I get the next slide, please? We discussed at the beginning that it's not helpful to the GP to give a discharge letter written by generic name, because the GP has an obligation to prescribe by brand. You're not helping the GP. You're helping the community pharmacist even less. So the MHRA is really clear, and again, they've changed the guidance about 4 times in the last 10 years, and as late as November 22, once again, substitution at the pharmacy level, and they do mean community pharmacy. They haven't used the word, but they do mean community pharmacy. Without consulting the prescriber is not permitted for biological medicines, including biosimilars. The community pharmacist receiving the script, say enoxaparin, needs to make contact with either the hospital physician or the GP. Both those things consume NHS resources to no purpose. They will clearly lead to considerable delay to the patient and not help the GP or the hospital doctor. The GPHC, which is the pharmacist, which is the regulated body for pharmacists, also says it is therefore not possible to switch enoxaparin brands in community pharmacy and is not in the interest of the patient. Again, putting the community pharmacist in a very difficult position of what to do next. The GPHC, which is the pharmacist's body, NHS England, again, have recently stated the practice of dispensing one medicine instead of another equivalent medicine at pharmacy level without consulting the prescriber is not permitted for biological medicines, including biosimilars. Again and again and again, we're putting pharmacists in a bad position. The Royal Pharmaceutical Society, at the point of dispensing, the pharmacist must confirm the patient has received the biologic they expect. That can present huge problems for community pharmacists. If they're receiving a branded prescription for our brand or the originator brand or a different brand, it's clear what was intended. It may be you're thinking, well, if the pharmacist asks me what brand I was expecting, I'll tell them. We are largely on this platform, HCPs and or educated people who understand medicine. I go back to our 84-year-old patient who gets asked, what brand of biosimilar are you expecting? I think that will be a question that most of them will have no understanding of the question's nature or the intended answer. And a lot of them will simply say that one, because again, not want to make a fuss. We are not helping the patient, we are not helping the NHS, we're not helping the GP, and we're not helping the community pharmacist. We're not saving money. Can I have the next slide, please? I always find data is very useful. And I never know whether it's data or data. I'll need to work out which continent I'm on, but forgive me if I've chosen the wrong pronunciation for the UK. In the UK at the moment, 72% of patients in hospital are initiated on Inhixa. And in primary care, 30% receive Inhixa. There is a considerable drop-off where they go from the brand that was intended, the brand that the physician chose, to ending up on a different brand. The vast majority of that is driven by open prescriptions for generic drugs. That means that a large percentage, my maths struggles, perhaps 40% of patients get the drug that was not intended by the original prescriber, which is not the intention of the regulator and shouldn't happen. The next bit largest brand has a 26% market share in hospitals. yet 50% of patients receive that drug. And that's because that's the originator, that's the brand that's most familiar for the last 30 years. The originator is a perfectly valid drug, very good quality drug. The reality is it's not the drug that was intended by the prescriber, initiating prescribing hospital, and it's not the device that the patient's been trained on, and it's not saved the NHS a penny. Another brand only has 2% market share in hospital, and yet there's 13% usage in primary care. Again, the patient's got a device that they perhaps don't understand, with different concentrations, different graduations, different techniques. The other brand there has simply got 0% because it's too small to have been picked up statistically what was intended. Can I have the next slide, please? Well, in summary, HCPs are good people who try to do the right thing. They generally think that by prescribing generically by INN, they are helping the NHS and they're doing nothing detrimental to the patients. We've shown that in reality, that's not what the regulator wanted them to do. I hope I've demonstrated it's not in the patient's best interest. I hope I've demonstrated that that doesn't result in a saving to the NHS, either in hospital or in primary care. I did tell you I was promotional, so one of the things that I would like to say as a very last comment is we always supply. We've never been out of stock in the UK in our history. And we would, again, encourage, and I'm fully aware that some people on this platform will have hospitals that use other brands. And to be really, really clear, we encourage you, if you're using a competitor brand in your hospital, to prescribe that brand for your patient. And if you're in a hospital that uses our brand, to use our brand. This is not about commercial sales. This is about making sure the patient gets a drug. An elderly 84-year-old patient goes home with a drug that they've mastered the technique from and gets given the same drug in the same device. If there are any questions, I'd be very happy to take them. We've also got a QR code here. Again, anything who wants to see any additional PI. And of course, please come to our digital stand in the lobby and we're happy to virtually chat to you. And thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much. That was very informative. And just to start off the questions, are there any protocols or examples of how secondary and primary care or pharmacists in the community have worked together to clarify with ease, without more layers of complication, the exact name, so that each understands what the communication is?
As you'll probably not be surprised to hear, there's a large variation. There, we see some really good examples of good practice where community pharmacists have the, as you call them, the LPCs, local pharmacy committees, have worked with the ICBs, and they have engaged in schemes, protocols to encourage pharmacists to make that contact with the GP and try and establish. We've also seen really strong communications from ICBs to trusts to ask them to do. So the answer is huge variability. There is other, I'll be very, very honest with you, there is also the position where in busy metropolitan towns such as Liverpool, Manchester, London, Leeds, etc., Glasgow. Actually, I'll remove Glasgow because it's different because of geography. But in big towns and cities like London, it can be very, very hard for the community pharmacist to establish even where the patient originated from, which trust. You can have situations where the trust uses one brand in one part of London, a different brand in another part, and it can be very, very hard even to work out what the intention was or what the patient had. So the answer is it's very, very complex. And again, to repeat, it's not in the patient's interest to change. It's not in the NHS interest. It doesn't save money.
And I guess that's added to when somebody may have care out of their area and then return. When they may have a good protocol, but it isn't in line with where they've just come back from.
This is you're absolutely correct. Social inequity is a problem. The people who are articulate, who are confident and competent, who understand the medication, generally ask for and receive the correct medication. In areas where pharmacists are good people as well, and they will often ask a patient, and there is a reality that a proportion of patients will not know which brand of biosimilar they're on. They won't be able to answer that question. So yeah, there's huge variation, enormous.
So where does somebody stand if they go along and say, well, this is what I was using, and it doesn't look like this?
Well, that's that's a question that as a pharmacist myself, I have been on occasions had very difficult conversations with community pharmacists, but where some community the problem comes that once the drug is physically handed to a patient, the regulations, the laws as it sits in the UK, when a drug leaves when a drug is given to a patient, it leaves a supply chain, and effectively, if the patient at that stage says this is not the brand I was anticipating, or even more so if they've left the community pharmacy and come back, the community pharmacist is looking at financial loss at that point. So I think it's better if a patient very early on raises that. And to be honest with you, both my company and other companies produce little handheld cards. And in essence, what they say in a form of words is, this is my biosimilar, this is the biosimilar I'm intended to have. I think it's great that our company does it. Our company does it because I'm articulate and I can tell to community pharmacists, this is what I want. But for people who are less confident, less articulate, perhaps it's not the first language, to be able to hand a pharmacist a card that says, this is what I want, this is why I want it, I think that's extremely useful. And that's a very powerful way. Some people are really brilliant. Some people bring their bag along with them and show the chemist up front, this is the brand I want. So there's a variation. There's definitely a variation. The saddest thing is when you get someone who's not self-confident, who knows it's wrong, who goes home, and a member of the family comes back 10 minutes later and tries to, because then is a very bad situation where there's a financial loss involved.
And I guess also, if then it does affect compliance with taking the drug, part of the looking into whether that's the doctor, the GP, or whoever has to look into that as to why they no longer compliant, has to perhaps consider, is it that they aren't so familiar with how they use this and safely administer it? And
that's a really interesting question, and one that, yeah, they're obviously, but because it's a population who are generally more elderly, there is a risk of compliance and concordance issues because it's a drug that's an injection, and it can be painful. The injection site can be painful. There are a lot of things that are leading to the possibility of non-compliance, non-concordance. And I think in that circumstance, the last thing we need to do is put an additional source of non-compliance, non-concordance into it. The community pharmacist will not lose money by dispensing the correct biosimilar because it's reimbursed at the list price. They may not make a profit, but they won't make a loss. And as I say, anything a discharging nurse can do to emphasize to the patient, here's some materials that you've been given by your manufacturer of your products, which we all do. Those materials can be shown to the community pharmacist and can help, I think.
So one of the things is on discharge, trying to be very clear to the individual, and maybe when they go to pick up their prescription or talk with their GP who might prescribe the next amount, there is that conversation initiated by the prescriber as well to just clarify. There is a really interesting point brought up though in the question about, and we've obviously seen this in the news over the last year, about some experiences of issues where patients have been discharged on a brand of low molecular weight heparin, and then there are shortages in primary care. And this has resulted in patients potentially missing doses at times, whilst the community pharmacy try to sort the supplies. And no one's fault. We've seen this as a global issue. Have you experienced this issue? And one of our thoughts, one of these people's thoughts, were that the generic prescribing might help alleviate this issue.
No, and that's actually that's a very common statement. The generic. So let me take it in two stages. I did say I was a promotional person, and again, we launched in the UK in 2019. You asked me a question: is this something that I've ever seen? The answer is no. We have never been out of stock in the UK, and that's not an accident. It's because our parent company, Heparins, is a Chinese company. We take, to put not too fine a point on it, we take the pigs' intestines from an abattoirs, multiple, very, very many multiple, and we turn them into the raw material heparin. We then refine the heparin into what's called API heparin, which is the pharmaceutical grade material. We then refine that into enoxaparin, API, pharmaceutical grade. We then turn that into Inhixa. We then distribute that. We then ship it ourselves to the UK and we distribute it through our chosen pre-wholesaler. My point being is we control every aspect of that supply chain. Because of that huge investment and because we hold an enormous amount in the UK, we've never been out of stock. And you talk about shortages, which are no one's fault. On 4 occasions in the last 5 years, we have stepped in and supported the Department of Health. When another brand has gone out of stock of limited heparin, we have offered our services to the Department of Health, and we have supplied every NHS trust that asked us temporarily to help them. So we haven't seen that problem, but it's a true problem. I hear what you're saying, that as a prescriber, if you write generically, then you may help the patient during a shortage. You've got to balance that against the patient may get the drug that wasn't intended in a device that they don't understand. For hospitals who are lucky enough to have Inhixa, if the trust writes Inhixa, the GP writes Inhixa, that problem in that geography will never exist. I don't know how to answer it in areas where other brands are used, but if your hospital using Inhixa and you discharge by brand, your patient will receive the right drug that they've been trained on.
Now, obviously, this is a sponsored symposium. I'm sure other companies are doing the same, but
absolutely.
Understanding the implications of changing that on no cost saving, patient usage and safety. When you then are working with a hospital or within a trust, is that, because this platform is an educational platform, is there also opportunity to help educate and explain, if whatever one you start with, these are the reasons why it's important to continue, unless it's contraindicated for some medical reason? No,
and again, I in no way want to be negative towards the other companies who I have the greatest respect for. We all train, we all educate. Our company is on the verge of launching an educational package for nurses, which will be approved by a UK college, again, just to raise the quality. And that will have a large component which will help the nurse understand the reason why the drug should not be changed, and will empower them or train them to train on to the patient and establish the reasons why not changing your brand is best for you. So yeah, you're absolutely correct. Education is the key. And within the next few weeks, we'll be launching we already do train, but we're now training in a more formal way with a recognised educational provider. So again, everybody wants the patient to have the drug they're supposed to have, and most importantly, the device they understand how to use. So I'm sure we are working to that, and I'm absolutely sure that the other low-molecular heparin companies will also be doing the same thing. None of us wants to see, I can't speak for everybody else, but I do not believe any of us want to see a patient switch from one brand to another, because we all want our patients to have the drug, and the best way to have the drug is by not being confused by a device switch.
Thank you. And you've raised really good reasons as to all the way through legally, use-wise and cost-wise, why that's really important. And so I think that is an excellent summary, and really good news about the educational programme. If anybody watching this or passing on to perhaps the prescribers that they work with want to make contact and find out more about the educational process, certainly during the next few weeks, they can go into the platform, to your stand, make contact, or look at the resources being offered there and understand more about the educational programme that's coming through. Is that right?
Absolutely. We would be so grateful if that happened. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And we wish you the very best for the rest of your conference.
That's okay. Thank you very much. A really informative talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.